Okay, so let's move along to today's presentation. Our speaker today is Jim Fields, who's the Managing Director of Studio Output in Beijing. Jim is the Managing Director of Studio Output's Beijing studio with deep experience in moving image, a wealth of knowledge of the Chinese builders culture, and over 10 years speaking Mandarin Chinese. After beginning his career in Silicon Valley at Adobe, he spent time at Nokia and Reckitt Benckiser, sorry, I might have got that wrong, before joining Studio Output in 2013 to oversee the company's expansion into China. As the Managing Director in Beijing, Jim's work involves managing all aspects of the business, from new business and pitching to creating a variety of Chinese language content. His work has gained millions of views across various platforms, both in China and internationally, for clients such as Reckitt Benckiser, Kunar, and Hyatt. All right, so let's move swiftly along. I think this is the point where I hand over to Jim, and Jim, I'm going to unmute you. Hello, Jim. We finally got there despite our technical hitches.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really excited about the opportunity to get to share about some of our experiences today. My name, as David mentioned, is Jim Fields. I'm the Managing Director at Studio Output. One thing you'll notice right away listening to me talk is that I myself am not from the UK. I'm from the Silicon Valley in the United States. Just before we get started, in the bottom left corner of the screen, you'll see a funny looking symbol. That's a QR code. You can scan that using WeChat on your phone if you want to have the opportunity to talk to me directly or ask any additional questions after we complete the talk today. So moving on to the second slide in the presentation. The first thing I wanted to do basically today was to kind of get a sense of who the audience was. So you'll see you can go to advance one forward, David. The first of these categories is that of the freelancer. So you'll see the depiction, an artistic depiction of that of a freelancer. The following being someone who works at an agency. You'll see Donald Draper. The next being someone who works on the client side or for a brand. And finally, someone who works for a production house or a production studio. So there was actually a poll question that we discussed adding here, but I wasn't sure necessarily if I gave David enough time to put those questions in through the system. But essentially, you'll see the poll question up now. It'd be really interesting to hear from you guys if you're in the creative industry, from what part of the industry you hail, and or it's possible also that you're just someone who's interested in the topic of market entry and business in China. So I suppose we'll see those responses come up soon. So as we wait for that, the point of asking for this information is determining, what we do a lot with the work that we do here in China or in advertising in general is thinking a lot about the audience. And when I talk to you guys today, it's helpful for me to have information about who the audience is so that I can, tell anecdotes and explain stories that are really relevant to you. So the thing I'm seeing here is that we actually don't have any freelancers who joined the call. We've got 11% of people who are agency employees, so people who come from the world of advertising. Clients and marketeers, people from the client side, and production studio employees at 20%. So it's a really interesting breakdown. So as we go forward, I'll try to make sure that the content that I explain breaks down in these categories. So moving on to the next portion. The reason that I came up with this presentation, the title of this presentation being How to Successfully Start and Operate Your Own Studio, is that since we set up here in China, I've had tons and tons of people, both in the UK, where our company is based, and also here in China, come to me and say that they were really interested in starting a business, or really interested in starting a studio specifically. And the point of the talk is basically explaining sort of the hard reality. I think there's a really romantic notion of establishing a business in China and accessing 1.4 billion consumers and being massively successful and turning over a lot of money and contributing to the success of the business in the UK or the home office in other parts of the world. And the point of this talk is to give you a sense of the financial realities that actually go into that process and give some vision into actually how our process has been, and hopefully give you guys some knowledge and insight into how you might go about opening your own operation in China. So moving on to the next slide. The first thing that I'll talk about today is the setup period. And again, advancing one more forward. during the setup phase, this is true for any business, not necessarily just one in the creative industry. You're faced with two sort of key options when you're making choices about how you want to move forward. And the first of these is that which is cheap and cheerful, which is an expression that I borrowed from my British colleagues. And the second is fantastic but expensive. And this will be sort of a motif that plays out throughout the rest of my presentation that you'll see as we go forward. So advancing one more slide. And we can just sort of page through the following section one by one. Cheap and cheerful resources and cheap and cheerful people basically play out in the following ways. So you'll have people or resources that you can bring on that can be very young and inexperienced, and as I mentioned before, they're cheap. So the initial investment that you put into China, if you're sort of pursuing a cheap and cheerful route, means that you'll have people who require a lot of direction, who can't necessarily respond to ambiguity, who aren't necessarily credible in front of clients or presenting the seniority or necessarily the experience to give clients confidence. The people who are cheap and cheerful, and especially in China, can be quite optimistic, but again, that's tempered by potentially being a bit naive. And finally, it's not all negatives. People that are cheap and cheerful believe in making the impossible possible. So the work ethic, of people here in China is pretty amazing. And we have had some hires, some people who joined our team who, despite having been, recent college graduates, have done incredible things and made some really made a lot of really tough situations and also helped us to achieve some really amazing results on our projects. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the fantastic but expensive. So this approach is basically about coming into China with a significant investment or access to a lot of capital, and then using that to obtain or hire resources that are more experienced, that have real connections, that can respond to ambiguity, but as I said before, they're expensive. They are realistic, but sometimes a bit jaded. And the other final piece with people who are fantastic but expensive is sometimes they struggle with the startup mentality. So for us, coming out of the world of, advertising, if we were to hire some people who are from agency backgrounds or come from these large kind of 4A advertising agencies, they may struggle with having to join an enterprise that's in the sort of startup mode. So moving forward to the next slide, which is about your financial and legal partner. Again, you'll see two options. So playing off the sort of things that we just discussed, one of the first things you have to do when you decide to incorporate in China is to select between financial and legal partner and accountancy firm that could be cheap and cheerful, and this is sort of a humorous depiction of what that might look like on the left, or one that may be more fantastic but also has a financial cost. And again, all the same things that I just talked about play out in the selection process. You could get a partner that maybe when you first look at incorporation partners and accountancy firms at the beginning that appears to be cheap and you think maybe it's good enough, but there may be some surprises. Whereas you could pick again, a quote-unquote fantastic partner that may have a big cost, but you'll have the safety and security of knowing that they'll do the job properly. Moving forward to the physical office, again, you have sort of a similar dichotomy. So looking at these two options again, for those of you who've been in Beijing, on the left side, you'll see on the top that the office that's cheap and cheerful could be quite far out of the city, which is on the North 6th Ring Road. For those of you who've been in Beijing, you know that this is about an hour and a half drive without traffic, or 3 or more hours if there is traffic. And then on the right side, you see a modern, fancy office with all the accoutrements. Moving forward, you'll see your equipment. So again, the cheap and cheerful option is you can get equipment that is secondhand or used and cheap, or you can get equipment that is fantastic but expensive. And then as we go forward, you start to consider the costs that are associated with starting up a business. So breaking down into different categories, you see the cheap and cheerful and the fantastic but expensive. So looking at things like construction or renovation for an office space, furniture, legal, financial, administrative setup, IT equipment. Even just in the startup phase, before you've hired any employees, you could be looking at incurring costs. And again, these aren't costs from our business, but just hypothetical costs for any business. Even in the cheerful and cheerful model, you'd be looking at costs of up to 280,000 RMB. And in the fantastic but expensive model, you could look at costs of up to 850,000 RMB. So this is, again, before you've even considered bringing on employees, but just to get an office running, to get furniture, to set up and get everything running, and to have functional equipment for employees, you're looking at some pretty serious costs. So moving on to the following slide, you'll see basically, like I just said, you're set up, you have an office, you have equipment, you have your legal and financial infrastructure set up. But now you need a team. So for our industry, again, we're a creative production studio. We have 5 key employees, which are yourself. You have to pay your own salary as an entrepreneur. You potentially have 1 salesperson. You have 2 people who perform creative work that then you bill onto your clients. And finally, you have a finance and administrative person. So moving on to the following slide, you'll see your staff. So on the left side, you have that which is cheap and cheerful, which is represented by Wang Baoqiang, who's a Chinese actor who's appeared in a lot of films like Lost in Thailand recently. And then on the right, you have a representation of someone who's fantastic but expensive, who is someone that I found in an online stock image gallery. So moving to the following slide, again, just giving you guys sort of a dashboard of the potential costs. When you look at that which is cheap and cheerful, and you look at staff, these are just month-by-month costs. So you could be looking on the cheap and cheerful side of the spectrum, the staff costs of 75,000 RMB, or in the fantastic but expensive world, 250,000 RMB. Again, this is just on a monthly basis. Office rent, 10,000 and 40,000, office overheads, 8,000, roughly approximately being the same. Things in utilities like internet, et cetera, are relatively cheap. Financial and professional services, again, there could be quite a wide window here. But again, tabulating all these costs together just to keep the lights on and keep the business operating on a monthly basis, you're looking at potentially 113,000 RMB in overheads on a monthly basis, including staff costs, just in the cheap option, and then again, 348,000 for the fantastic but expensive. So those are just sort of quick numbers to give you guys some perspective. Again, these are all pretty hypothetical, but just to give you perspective in terms of the costs associated with opening a business and opening a studio.
Jim, I've got a question here, if that's okay.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a question here from Mark, and are there any restrictions on the type of work a foreign agency can do? So I guess, in this whole setting up phase, it would be important to know if there are any, you don't want to go down a path of opening something and then realizing that you actually can't do the work or something like that. So are there any considerations in that field?
That's a really good question. So in China, when you open or register a business, you have to make a lot of decisions about what type of company you want to be, and you register in certain classes that allow you then to perform certain types of services. So there's certain kinds of industries that tend to be a lot more sensitive, like things like media, things relating to journalism, things relating to categories that potentially could have more interaction with the government, or could be sensitive in terms of mass media or dissemination of information. For what we do, which is video production, it actually falls outside of some of those categories because the thing we do is focusing much more on just the creation of content, not about the dissemination or posting of content, and it's not anything that's sort of political or journalistic in nature. But yeah, there are certain industries, certain sectors that do have more regulation. There obviously are foreign companies like news organizations and advertising agencies that have successfully incorporated in China, but a lot of those companies will come in with pretty serious capital and investment to make sure that they're successfully open. So yeah, I mean, it is important to make sure that before you, consider rolling out in China that you have a plan for the type of work that you want to do and ensure that the items and things you'd be billing to your clients are actually items that you'd be able to register a business in, items you'd be able to actually list on the invoices that you give to clients.
Okay, so just furthering that a little from my side, generally speaking, sort of the public-facing creative work, like the work that you do or advertising, these sorts of things, they're not restricted in too many ways to foreign players. Generally, you can access those markets. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, advertising is kind of a funny one, to be honest. Like I said, the thing that we do is much more around the production of video content. Advertising does have implications in terms of bought media space and sort of mass media, and that stuff starts to get more sensitive. But if it's more about creative work or strategy, things that are much more about selling services to brands directly as opposed to, then again, like I said, influencing the media, then it gets to be more flexible. But I would be, like many things in China, it's not a black and white issue. It's a little bit complicated to sort of explain fully.
Thanks very much. Okay. Moving on then to yourself. Yeah.
So essentially, moving forward, as we'd said, we're getting into the next slide, which is sort of a summary of the first 3 months. So moving one more slide forward, tabulating together the costs that you incur for the startup phase, and then looking at your first 3 months. In the cheap and cheerful side, you're looking at a total burden of 619,000 RMB. And then in the fantastic but expensive side, you're looking at, again, adding all those incorporation costs, and then your first 3 months of overheads, including staff, over 1 million RMB in costs, which would then get you to 1.894 million RMB. So again, it's pretty significant when you look at all this to realize, actually, it's not necessarily as cheap as you might think. Even with just a small number of staff, you actually have to consider a pretty serious capital investment if you want to run a business that's registered and that's able to issue these precious sort of FAPIAO invoices to clients, that has an office and is presentable, etc. So you understand costs. We can move to the following slide. But what about profit? So again, advancing one more slide. This is something that probably many of you already know as entrepreneurs or people who come from the business world. But there's obviously a distinction between the profit that you make on each individual project and the profit that your business makes as a whole. Coming from the freelance world, one reason I asked who was sort of a freelancer before was that basically your entire profit you make on any job basically just goes against all your life expenses, and it represents profit, so there's less distinction. But for people who run businesses or who are entrepreneurs, obviously, the profit that you make on any job basically just goes against all the overheads and everything else you incur as a company. So advancing one slide forward, basically it means that there's a lot to consider, because for the profit you have on each individual job, that's only something that you achieve after you've subtracted all the hard costs for each individual project. So considering a field like ours, which is sort of a creative area, again moving one more slide forward, we aim to achieve potentially something around a 33% profit margin on each project. And that's actually a pretty good margin, because it's representing the fact that if you subtract all your costs from an individual project, that you still maintain a pretty significant area of profit. So what does that actually look like? Moving to the following slide. So just as an example, this is something just like kind of, again, a hypothetical budget for a photo shoot. So looking at this, you have all the individual suppliers and vendors and people that you have to pay in the course of a photo shoot, whether it's the photographer, people who do wardrobe, makeup, talent, stylists, etc. And those costs are significant, and they all account for individual portions of the budget. So essentially, if all those costs are controlled, as we mentioned before, then you have the ability to retain a 33,000 RMB profit on the job. Advancing one slide forward. So what you'll notice actually is that if there are changes to the scope that occur along the way, this is a little bit of a joke, but it's sort of a joke that's sort of steeped in reality. You can actually have surprises that occur, which, again, like I said before, shades of gray. Another thing that people who've done business in China for a long period of time will tell you is surprises happen. Changes to scope in your work, or changes to contracts, or clients who don't necessarily understand the process. These things are pretty frequent. And this example is just that the client has decided spontaneously to hire an additional photographer, a more expensive photographer, which represents a big additional cost. So anyway, we can pretend that that didn't happen and move forward to the following slide. So going back to where we were before, you have a great team. You're hitting this 33% margin on all jobs. So how much basically do you need to bill back to your clients if you want to make a profit as a company? Again, not talking about the individual profit on each project, but if you want to make a profitable business, what kind of numbers do you have to be doing for this all to make sense? So moving to the following slide, you'll see, again, these two options, the cheap and cheerful, the fantastic but expensive. So as we said, for the cheap and cheerful option, for your first 3 months, you were looking at a total of 619,000 RMB. Again, assuming that you have to basically bill 3 times that amount, and then take that back as 33%, representing the profit of coming from the turnover in the job. That means that you'd need to bill that equivalent amount, which is 1.87 million RMB to your clients in order just to break even. And then on the fantastic but expensive side of the spectrum, you'll see the same principle at play. So with your total costs, overhead, staff, everything else, at 1.894 million, you'd actually be needing to bill 5.682 million RMB to clients just not to make a profit as a company, but just to break even. So it's actually, again, you're looking at some pretty serious, real billings that you have to make in order to be profitable, or even just to break even as a company in your first 3 months in China.
Jim, I've got a question that just come up from a couple of people. This brilliant 33% profit that you're making, have you encountered any difficulties getting it, say, out of China? Or are there any paths that you would recommend with your industry to do that?
That is a really good question. So there's a few different answers that I could propose or sort of explain related to that. One thing that you can do, so for our company, the way that we're structured is that we have a local business here in China, we have a Hong Kong company, we have a British business. In terms of the way that you can transfer money, there's different ways to do it, right? You can, we have some clients who prefer to actually sign contracts with our UK business, so the client would take on the burden of having to transfer money abroad to that company, which avoids a lot of issues. In terms of transferring money, we have a really good partner, a good accountancy partner. As I mentioned before, it's really important to find the right partner when you do incorporation in China. And I'd be happy to share the information for our partner with anyone after we complete this call. But if you find the right partner, that's another good strategy in terms of migrating funds or money between different countries or different markets. There are certain impediments to that, in terms of there's restrictions that exist and restrictions that are put in place to make sure that things are done above board and taxes are paid. So it's obviously important to find a way to do that remains in compliance with rules and laws and regulations.
So it's just to sum up there, it's not some sort of mad deal breaker difficulty for you. There's hoops to jump through, but it is possible. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely possible. And having, I think, an incorporated business in China, another one in Hong Kong, and then another one in your home market that clients can pay directly to, those options usually yield enough flexibility to not present too many issues in the day-to-day operation of the business.
All right. Thanks very much.
So moving forward then, the question that a lot of people have asked when I've given this talk previously has been, how do you actually get all this money? Because when you come into a market, it's not, unless you have a serious capital investment from your company or yourself or some wealthy benefactor, you always ask this question. So I've broken down sort of scenarios here. So option one that you'll see is that you basically start up in China with a few big accounts or clients and use the profits from the deals you make with those clients in order to offset your initial growth. So this is obviously really difficult in the first few months because you need to have people and infrastructure and everything else in order to actually deliver on projects for clients. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. But there have been a lot of case studies and stories of successful advertising or creative companies in China that are led by people who, for instance, walk out of another company and have good relationships with certain accounts and use those relationships and accounts then to finance their initial development. The second option you'll see is outside investment. So, very self-explanatory. It's basically just about having a war chest of money so that when you do come in, you can, successfully incorporate and pay your employees, etc. So if you're, some individual sort of wealthy person, this is something you could do yourself, or you could seek investment, but the cost being that you'd lose potentially equity shares and decision-making power. And the third option is you start very small, you keep your own equity, and do things in a cheap and cheerful way, and make your own decisions and grow larger over time. So this has the benefit of controlling more of an equity stake in your business in China. But the drawback of not necessarily always being able to have the fancy office and the experienced, fantastic employees right off the bat. And the final one you'll see at the bottom is, some combination thereof. So that basically just says you could, fuse a few of these options together in a solution that works for you and your business. So on the following slide, I just wanted to kind of close out things in my explanation today by explaining Studio Output's story. So the question that we get quite a bit after I give this, again in this talk is, how did we make it through that initial first 3-month period? Because that represents sort of a crucial point for businesses here in China. And for us, we had the good fortune of, for one, starting off with a really good client. So we were brought to China as a company because we were approached about doing a really interesting project that was going to be at the bird's nest here in Beijing. And that project, coupled with support, financial and time and effort and support from our team in the UK, were the first 2 key steps. And then in addition to that, we had the support of our first few local clients. So when we incorporated, we looked into our local network and people that we could potentially consider as clients for future projects. So beyond the first project, we had some brave clients who decided to work with us at the very beginning. And through those 3 things working together, really, we actually pushed through and made it through the first 3 months. So the following slide then is how do we make it 2 years? So Studio Output essentially started working in China. We did our first project here in 2012, but we actually started formally operating as a business in 2013 in March. So here we are. It's been 24 months, 2 years later, and we've sort of successfully built up, and we have a good set of really great clients. We have moved out of our initial office, which was very cheap and cheerful, basically as an apartment, into a proper place that we can then have clients in, and we're achieving some good success here in Beijing. So how do we make it? And as you'll see in the following slide, you'll see that we've done so by sourcing a great team. So this is obviously somewhat of a cliche in terms of business, but it is massively important in China that you find a team who's able to execute on projects, one that is built of people whose vision and personality is consistent with the values of your business in your home country. And it's extremely important to find that set of people. And I think that most of our success in China owes, to our initial support and everything from the organization in the UK, but also to the people that we've managed to find here in China. So moving forward, you'll see a chart which is actually a little bit difficult to read. It seems like there's been some sort of formatting issue. But it's basically just saying where we are now. I think the black background has disappeared. But essentially it's a dashboard, and you'll see that you have essentially a representation of the fact that we're on the path now as a business from the cheap and cheerful to the fantastic but expensive. And we're still kind of figuring things out on the way. So what's next for us? The next big project that Studio Output's doing in China is going to be, we're really excited, about a lot of the future projects that we have on. But one in particular that we're just about to do is we're working with a few ex-engineers from Google who are creating a tablet they're about to launch here in China. So this is just one example of the kind of opportunities and jobs that you can get here as a foreign enterprise set up. There's a lot of really exciting things in store for us in the business. One last thing that you guys can do is if you scan my QR code, we can also add you guys to the list for a series of events that we do in Beijing called Glug. So advancing to the final slide in my presentation, you'll see the QR code that's been in the corner displayed in full screen. So we do a series of events called Glug in Beijing, which is about connecting people from the creative industry. And if you scan me on here, then I'm happy to add you to that event, and hopefully I'll have the opportunity to see you all in Beijing at some point soon. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much for that, a positive, inspirational and presentation, which should give, I think, our listeners today that a realistic, pragmatic, but positive impression of what it's like to start a creative agency in China. I would ask you, if you have any questions, just type them in. We've got a couple here. I've got a question here from Susan. How easy is it to find creative talent compared to the UK or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the answer is that it's very difficult. Beijing and
That's the easy
Shanghai,
answer.
yeah. Yeah, Beijing particularly, I would say you look at China, you see Beijing and Shanghai as the two hubs where a lot of creative work gets performed. Shanghai actually has a lot more advertising agencies. Beijing tends to be a bit more about the grassroots kind of creative music, art community. Finding good creative people in China is quite hard, and that owes to a lot of different things, whether it be a lack of an education system that encourages that kind of creativity, but also yeah, just the fact that it's quite a new industry. Advertising here is something that only has existed, for the past couple of decades, unlike a lot of other markets where it's been around for much longer.
Well, Jim, do you have would you have an approach? Like, do you have maybe a college where you've picked a couple of guys that you've found have been,
Yeah.
Do you have some sort of system that suits you, or characters who've gone to a certain university and they just happen to get on with your style or get it? Like, do you have your way of doing that?
Yeah, so for us it's a combination of different things. One is we do this event series in which we bring local creative people together, which is sort of, I guess, a subcategory of networking, getting out in the community, meeting people. The second is we've done various outreach things with the Beijing Film Academy as well as the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and there's the Communications University in Beijing, these three being kind of centers for study of design and film, animation, and we've had some success getting students who come out of those places. And the final one is, obviously, there's people who are already demonstrating success at other competitor companies or at other advertising agencies, other production houses.
Okay.
So we've also found people, through LinkedIn and through people who work at other companies.
Okay, I've got following on from that, just Cooper has asked, how does Shenzhen compare to Shanghai and Beijing in terms of sourcing creative talent?
So Shenzhen is a city that's only, like I said, everything's sort of new here, but Shenzhen's a city where almost no local people live, and essentially the big industries there are mostly around heavy manufacturing and factories. I can't imagine that it would be easy to find good people there. I don't know much. I don't actually know any companies, any ad agencies that have bases in Shenzhen. So you could see that as an opportunity, but I think you could also see it as, not necessarily being a booming industry there.
And there's quite a few follow-on questions on this specific area of talent, clearly. I have a question from Thomas. How much staff turnover do you have, and is it a problem?
That sounds like somebody who's had a business in China. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's a concern, right? The situation here is that there's not much loyalty often in terms of business. So people tend to bounce around quite a bit in the creative industry, particularly between ad agencies, and that's motivated by the fact that it's one of the only ways to get a significant pay bump, people jumping between companies. And the next question that would follow from that is, how do you mitigate that? How do you stop people from leaving? For us, we found a combination of making sure the culture of our company is really strong, so having a set of values and having activities outside of work that bring people together, and also trying to pay people enough so that they feel motivated to stay.
Yeah, I mean, that again brings us on to another question, which has just popped up in terms of salary levels.
Yep.
Are you able to disclose, or do you tell us a little bit about how you pitch those, maybe relative to the UK or relative to other roles in the UK? Are your creatives more or less expensive?
Speaking in sort of general terms, I guess, I don't want to get into anything too specific.
Of course.
The thing you'll find in China is that administrative roles or roles in supporting positions or junior roles tend to be much cheaper. So compared to the UK, you could find people in those kind of junior positions who can come in for way cheaper than they would be in other markets like the UK. But if you get into senior roles, creative directors, senior art directors, motion designers, animators, directors of photography, those people can be either as expensive or actually significantly more expensive because they're people who demonstrated success in their home markets and they're, established.
Demand,
also,
I guess. Yep.
Yeah, they're in demand, and there's also sort of a perception of the hardship cost of being in Beijing, so they may want to be paid more money to actually be in China than they would in any other market. So I would say it's kind of a bell curve, or I don't know what the right metaphor is, but essentially it's a lot cheaper for the the junior end people, but potentially as expensive, not more expensive for senior hires.
That's very interesting. Staying a little bit on the personnel issue, I have a question from David here. How hard to find good salespeople in China? So a slightly different aspect, but obviously equally important part of the business.
Yeah, that's that's another really good question, and it's very, very difficult. The thing, I guess, in terms of sales and account management in China is that, how to phrase it without sounding sort of cynical. People who are good salespeople oftentimes go on to establish their own businesses in China. So finding a good salesperson who's driven, who's also loyal, is often a big challenge. And also there's a lot of, I suppose it's just a very difficult thing, because as a foreign business, you're going to want to find people who are understanding of your company values and who you are and what you're trying to do. And sales in China isn't necessarily seen as being a very glamorous role. So the personalities that are drawn to it, I mean, I could give a whole talk just about sales in China, but suffice to say,
maybe we'll get you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, moving away from the personnel, side, just to a few other aspects of the business, because the questions are coming in thick and fast. Is short-term office space or shared creative space available, or do you find you have to sign up to a long lease?
So we did what a lot of companies probably do in terms of our process, which was initially we shared an office with another creative company, and then after that we rented an apartment that was a personal apartment and worked out of that. And then finally, after we had some success, we then established in a proper real office, an office building in a nice part of the neighborhood. You can find, there's serviced office areas. We investigated that at the beginning, but they're not really attenuated for the kind of scrappy startup companies. I mean, they're really quite expensive, and you're having maybe a bit of a benefit because you're only paying month to month, but actually they are massively expensive, and the things that you get from them in terms of having internet taken care of and water and coffee in the pantry are actually something that you get much cheaper with just a good administrative support and working either like I said, out of an apartment or out of a shared office space. So I would say definitely not to consider those types of options. And yeah, there's various things. There's creative studios. I mean, again, these are things maybe I could answer one-to-one, but there are some places you can go and work in kind of shared creative spaces. But if you want to incorporate, then you actually have to have a listed address on your business license in China. So if you did consider that facet, you actually do have to have a listed office space with a mailing address that people can actually physically go to. So it sort of depends on how you want to approach it.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, maybe we'll take a few questions on, I suppose, on the content and success of the work that you do. One question here from Jane. How important is it to localize content for a Chinese audience? What would the differences be with the UK or US, for example?
Yeah, it's massively important, and that's a really good question. I think maybe sometimes there's an assumption that the only thing you need to do is add subtitles or, for instance, redo the titles at the beginning and end of the film, but actually it's much, 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 much more sophisticated than that. One example of that for us is that, we got hired by Durex, which is a sort of a condom manufacturer, which is also a British company that's part of Reckitt and Kieser, and they wanted to create a film about a certain product. And the original narrative strategies we proposed for them were basically deemed to be absolutely inappropriate for the China market, and that was for a number of reasons. There's concerns about censorship, but also just culturally, there's a totally different set of visual metaphors and beliefs and practices around that kind of stuff. So getting the voice right and telling stories that actually are relevant here is much, much more sophisticated than just changing the language, and I think that can't be overestimated for China.
Very interesting. Thank you. And do you work, just from your company, do you work primarily with agencies or direct with clients, brands, etc.? Where have you found that you sort of fit into the food chain?
At the very beginning when we established, we tended to work a bit more with agencies directly, and for us that was for a number of reasons. I think one is that it's a lot easier to connect with folks from agencies. They tend to do a much better job of promoting the people who work there, which makes it easier to connect with decision makers and creative staff. But as time has gone on, obviously as a company you want to look at where real opportunity lies. And sometimes with agencies, they have their own financial goals. They need to make profit on jobs. And by the time things get to you as a production studio, a lot of the value and the total, sort of revenue on the project is already really diminished. So at the beginning, as I said, we worked more with agencies, but going forward, I think our goal is to work more with brands.
Okay, and a final question from Mark. Have you experienced difficulty winning new business as a foreign company? I guess Mark means that relative to domestic competition. Is that really how does that dynamic work now?
Yeah, these are all really good questions, really insightful questions. And to that question, I think as a foreign company, in the creative area, you have a big advantage because for whatever reason, there's this association with foreign enterprise, particularly British companies, of being creative, of being innovative, of doing interesting creative work. The thing you'll bump into in China is that I think that's a principle that's true, but then you get into the actual executional part of winning the job. And sometimes you'll deal with, a lot of the cliches you hear about China, whether it's corruption or you're going against a company where it's actually a predetermined victory for another agency who has a certain relationship with people who are within that brand, which makes things challenging. But also just in terms of the conversations that you have, I think it's quite important to have a good account team who actually understands the political landscape within your client organization, because you could actually hear from the person who gives you the brief that the job is one way. But in reality, if you don't have a good account team who can really see into the organization, determine who the decision makers are, it actually would be really hard for you to win business in China.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think we'll leave it there for today. I'd like to say really thank you very much, Jim, for your frank, pragmatic, positive and candid approach to this. I think it's been really, really refreshing to hear kind of warts and all the journey that you've had setting up and running your agency in China. I wish you all the best. So thank you very much for your time this morning. For the rest of you listening in today, if you have any further questions, please do contact me and I'll be happy to pass them on to Jim. As I said earlier in this webinar, this is part of a 5-part series, and the next one will be on the 20th of March, and it will be from one of my colleagues here at the China-Britain Business Council, Mark Headley, and it will be on e-commerce. Now, because you're at this, you're automatically registered for the next one as well. So the 24 hours beforehand, you will receive a reminder email, 24 hours and 1 hour. So I think following on from today's excellent presentation, the issue of e-commerce will be one that will be equally relevant. All of these webinars are recorded and put onto our website, so you will be able to see them easily enough on our website, and we'll give you details about that. Well, that pretty much concludes everything for today. So as I said, thank you very much to Jim, and thank you very much to all of you for your time. I wish you all the best and happy business with China. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.